This video is part 2 of Chapter 6, Love and Sexuality for PSY 345, Human Sexual Behavior. In this part of the lecture, we're going to start with one of the more interesting research areas that I've had a chance to learn a little bit more about in the last couple of years on polyamory and open relationships, or what is more commonly being called consensual non-monogamy in the research literature now. The research on these kinds of relationships has always been a little bit controversial, but it's becoming more normalized among psychologists and sexologists because there's been more openness and more conversation that then itself translates into more research. Polyamory is defined in a variety of different ways, depending on who's doing the research and what their background and their home discipline is. For psychology, the tendency is to define it in terms of more than two individuals in relationship. And the language here that your authors are using, more than two individuals in a pair bonded relationship. So you may have two individuals who are married to each other, but then other individuals who are within that relationship sphere, who are not married to each other, but they're in various forms of pair bonds with each other. And there's a lot of variability in the way polyamorous relationships are structured, for want of a better word. Polyamorous relationships are characterized by emotional bonds, sexual bonds, and frequently parenting relationships with, as a part of the interactions. As I said, there's a tremendous amount of variability in how polyamorous relationships are structured. In some cases, you have two individuals who have, an intimate and passionate relationship, and an additional person who has more companionate bonds with the other two. In some cases, you have passion and romance and intimacy among all the parties. So there's really a tremendous amount of variability in the way people have built their relationships in polyamory. It's estimated that between 4 and 5% of individuals, and most of this research has been done in the US and Europe, but the estimate is around 4% to 5% of individuals. Now, what's not included in that number is non-Western cultures, where you may have different norms and expectations about monogamy, about poly types of relationships that are governed by cultural tradition. So most of the research has been in the United States, in North America, and in Europe. What hasn't been found is significant differences in the quality of relationships and the stability of them. So one of the stereotypes of poly relationships or consensual non-monogamous relationships is that you have highly fractious, lots of fighting, lots of instability in these relationships. But when you really look at comparisons, there's really no difference. So you can have fractious, difficult, failing relationships that are monogamous, and you can have difficult, fractious, failing relationships in poly connections, just as you can have positive, committed, stable relationships as well. So that kind of goes against the stereotype that poly relationships are unstable and somehow fundamentally immoral. And that's sort of the value judgment side of it. In cultures that tend to value both in terms of just their values and belief system, but also in terms of their legal system. Cultures that have a high value on monogamous relationships and legal marriages tend to frown upon and stigmatize polyamorous or consensually non-monogamous relationships. So there tends to be a whole lot of stigma and stereotyping that goes into describing these relationships that really isn't borne out by the data. So there's an assumption that these are people who can't commit, who don't have, who have surface relationships, they don't really have intimacy with their partners, that they cheat rampantly, and since they can't really commit or they can't avoid being people who are unfaithful, they engage in these non-monogamous open relationships as a way of getting around being in a quote-unquote real relationship. So those stigmatizing beliefs tend to lead individuals who are polyamorous, at least until recent years, to really hide that fact and to keep that information under wraps because there is still social stigma attached to it. Now, the research shows that there are some advantages and different disadvantages. On the plus side, people report that having a polyamorous relationship or set of relationships really adds to variety. It allows you to have different kinds of deeply committed relationships with different kinds of people. So there's more mental stimulation, more emotional stimulation, and so on. There's also, if you have a consensually non-monogamous relationship, you don't have the burden of having dishonest affairs where you have people who sneak around and have relationships outside of, say, a marriage or a committed relationship that they have to lie about. So if you have a consensually non-monogamous relationship, you're not hiding it. And typically in these relationships, there are agreements about what are the rules of the game for how you're going to navigate your relationships. In poly relationships, you tend to have people who are committed to each other in fairly long-term ways, which is different from open relationships where the conversations are a little different in that respect. So here we're just talking about polyamorous relationships. Some people report on surveys and in interview research that it kind of feeds a need that they have to have different needs met by different kinds of people. So you may have, very high needs for romance, and that's met by one partner, but you also have, commitment needs and intimacy needs that are more strongly met by a different kind of person, and vice versa. So the different people who are involved in the relationship may satisfy each other's needs in different ways. On the disadvantages side, it is a myth that jealousy is non-existent in the poly world. You do have to learn how to understand your own feelings of jealousy and manage those feelings in healthy ways. This is one of those situations where what we're learning by actually actively studying people in poly relationships is that, like what we've learned from investigations of the BDSM community, people who are in successful polyamorous relationships tend to engage in a higher level of open communication about their needs, about what they want, about what they can and cannot tolerate, and so on. So in successfully navigated relationships, you have a lot more openness in conversation, a lot more discussion. And that's one of the ways that those feelings of jealousy get worked out. But you can't minimize the possibility that that's something you have to work on. There's also in survey research and in interview research of people who have had polyamorous relationships or who are currently in them, that they do have to navigate how to have time with each other in a way that feels fair and satisfying, recognizing that each person involved in these relationships is going to have very different needs. And again, what the research literature is starting to show is that in successful polyamorous relationships, there's a high degree of communication, which there's this kind of reciprocal relationship. The more communication there is, the higher the perception of intimacy. The higher the perception of intimacy, the more time is committed to having open conversations and so on. Now, emotional intimacy in polyamory is another one of those things where you really have to fight against the stereotypes. The stereotypes of polyamory are that you have people who can't commit and can't be faithful, so they engage in these very fleeting non-monogamous connections. Well, in the actual research, what's the picture that is emerging now that people are actually being studied in an honest way is that emotional intimacy tends to be very important in polyamorous relationships because people have to be very intentional about what they're doing. So what we're finding in the research literature is that these are people who tend to have pretty long-term relationships. Their lives tend to be intertwined in much the same way that monogamous couples' lives are intertwined, like having finances that are intertwined, households that are intertwined, life decisions that are made in a shared way. There are frequently children who are a part of the picture of the polyamorous family. Another stereotype about polyamorous individuals is that they have toxic families, that they can't be stable enough to raise children, or that they shouldn't be permitted to raise children because they're obviously living a life that is just filled with nothing but sex, which leads to another stereotype that all these people are doing is having sex constantly, that it's one big orgy, which is not reflected in the research literature at all. Now, this distinction that your authors are drawing between primary partners who have what's more like, it would be comparable to the way we imagine monogamous partnerships, marriages, cohabitation relationships, where you have a lot of intertwined life decision making. There are also some poly relationships where there are secondary partners who are involved with the other partners, but they're sometimes not living with them. They may keep their lives separate. They may live in a different location, even at quite a distance. But their emotional connections are there. They just may not be quite as intense or as intertwined as the primary partners are. But as I said, there's tremendous diversity in the way poly relationships can be structured. And it's not just 3 people, it could be more than that. It just really depends on the individuals involved. Now, in addition to primary and secondary partners, there are some cases where you have what are called tertiary relationships within the polyamorous set of connections. And as the name implies, these are individuals who may be more long distance and more casual in their kind of interaction with the other individuals involved in the relationship. So what one sex researcher mentioned in a podcast I was listening to a little while ago is that in some poly relationships, the primary partners and maybe even the primary partners with their secondary partners, they may have these connections, these tertiaries that are more like hookups or friends with benefits that are a part of their circle of polyamorous relationships, but they're not as deeply, intimately rolled up in the everyday, day-to-day of the life of the primary partners, for example. So what this is showing us is that you can have various constellations, essentially, of connections among people within a polyamorous relationship. Now, open relationships, it used to be called swinging. In some areas of the literature, it's one variety of consensual non-monogamy. Open relationships are defined as where you have, in a partnership, it could be a marriage or it could be a long-term committed relationship, each partner agrees that they can have sex with other people. And sometimes they can have emotional relationships in addition to the sexual interactions with other people. More often casually, although it can sometimes be, emotional as well. In the past, it was more common to call this swinging. That term kind of comes in and out of favor depending on, the prevailing culture. The tendency, at least in U.S. culture and in European culture, is for this to be more about recreational sex, where people are wanting to engage in a variety of sexual interactions with partners without necessarily a commitment. They don't want to give up their primary relationship, and most people who engage in these interactions report that they love their partner, but they need something sexually that is beyond the scope of their current relationship. For couples where this actually works for them, they have an agreement, they understand each other well, and they mutually, either both of them engage in swinging or one engages in it with the tacit permission granted by the other. It is estimated, and it really depends on the study you look at, and there's a wide range of estimates here. Somewhere from 4 to 15 million people report that they have open relationships. It's very hard to pin down that number, though. Like with polyamorous relationships, there's a social stigma attached to open relationships. Lots of people in U.S. culture believe that it's not possible to have a marriage where you are permitted to have sex outside of that marriage and it's okay. It kind of violates our romance norms of monogamous relationships. But in fact, the research shows that there are individuals and couples who have found a way of navigating consensual non-monogamy in a way that works for them. Like what I said about polyamorous relationships, these relationships work when people have very open lines of communication and they set boundaries and limitations for each other that they both respect. Where open relationships are problematic is when those things don't happen, where one partner is really pushing for the open relationship, the other partner is not, but the one partner just does it anyway. Or if the boundaries are pushed, maybe the relationships that one person is having outside of the primary relationship become too emotionally invested, then jealousy can arise and so on. When researchers ask people who engage routinely in open relationships or who have had their primary relationship and the partners agree to have an open relationship, the rules that kind of rise to the surface as being common among these people are saying that you have to be honest. If you're going to have sex with someone, you have to be honest about it happening and under what circumstances. The agreement is typically that the sex be recreational, i.e., not emotional. So you're not having a relationship with someone else. You're essentially hooking up. It could be the same person, it could be a serial hookup, but it's for recreational purposes. For many people who engage in swinging, which in some cases there are groups of people who network, and they have swinging communities, or there are clubs where they meet. There's even apps for it. Of course, there's an app for it. There's probably 100 of them. Anyway, for many of those individuals, there are agreements about STI testing. There's a requirement of condom usage so that you're not infecting your partner unknowingly. There's also, for many couples who engage in open relationships, they get to have veto power. So, if one partner is, say, going to hook up with said person, in some of these relationships, the primary partner gets to say, no, not that one. And, in the relationships that work, those boundaries are respected. One norm that has evolved since the onset of the internet is that arranging connections, arranging sexual interactions has become in some ways an online thing. So there's a lot more ways for people to identify potential partners, and to do some screening. There was a period of time, especially during the 1960s and 70s, where swinging tended to be a social activity that was engaged in communities, sometimes with social clubs like bars. In some cases, they were loosely created social networks of people who simply knew each other, which is where spouse swapping kind of came into play. But a lot of those stories are kind of urban legend driven, so more fiction than fact. Now, we need to shift gears away from talking about poly relationships and consensual non-monogamy to talking more globally about what are some things that have been found to be threats or hurdles that can come into play and damage intimate sexual relationships. And, we should pause here and you should ask yourself the question, what do you think are the common threats to intimate sexual relationships? What are the big things that can cause people to have problems in their relationships? Well, one of the number one things that should be springing to mind for you is the experience of jealousy, a remarkably human experience. We tend, when we love someone, if we feel that they are attracted to another person, it's a threat to the love relationship that we have. We may feel that that our presence in that person's life is being threatened. So that experience of jealousy is a powerful emotional thing. It can be a slow burn, or it can be a white hot monster. So that's a threat. When people are quick to feel jealousy, or if it is slower onset, it can still be a threat. There's also a threat in the form of sexual guilt. So when people feel like their own sexual values are being ignored or threatened or overridden in their sexual relationship, they may feel guilty about what they're doing. So, for example, if you have an individual who has been raised to believe that sex outside of marriage is inappropriate, but their current partner who they love wants to have sex but doesn't want to get married yet, you may feel like in order to keep that relationship going that you have to have sex. That can create guilt. Or guilt can arise in a situation where you feel like you're attracted to, say, a friend's partner, and you cross a line with that partner. That can cause sexual guilt. So it's another set of powerful emotions that can be problematic. There's also what your authors call obsessive relational intrusion, where you have a person with whom you are not in love, who is persistently kind of just trying to invade your love relationship. So you may have some sort of person, might be a third friend or any person outside of your relationship who keeps pushing themselves in between you and your partner. Typically, if you're going to call it obsessive relational intrusion, the obsessive component is where, you have one person who wants one of the partners to leave that relationship and be with them. Then they are persistently trying to, kind of horn in on that relationship, convince the person that they are attracted to that the partner that they're with isn't worth it, that they're better, and so on. That can be a threat. That can then be taken up to another level in the form of stalking, which is, variously defined. There are actually legal codes for it, but repeated, intentional pursuit and harassment of one person by another person. And it can often, take the form of having sexual overtones to it. So frequently, stalking has this pervasive kind of sense of sexual threat, particularly when it's reported by women and is being perpetrated by men. But there's no requirement that that be the case. Now, I've told you before, I'm a very visual person. This is a graphic that I think helps us to think about another major threat to intimate relationship, which is violence. Beyond stalking, you also have to think about the power dynamics that are always possible within intimate relationships that can turn into abusive and violent relationships. So and I like this graphic because if you have an intimate relationship that is characterized by power and control, where one partner exerts a great deal of power and control over the other partner, there's always the potential for that power differential to become toxic. There are relationships where by agreement, one partner is more dominant and the other partner is less so, and it works for them. So I don't want to just blanket pathologize relationships that have somewhat unequal levels of power. But that said, if you have a relationship that is characterized by one partner having a great deal of power and control over the other, and it involves the other things on this wheel, where you have the person in power using threats and coercion, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, using minimizing, denying, and blaming. If there are children involved, using the children as a means of blackmail. In the dynamic where you have a male in a relationship with a female, or if you're talking about a gay male relationship, there is research showing that the use of male privilege in the form of expecting highly stereotyped roles for people to play, such as, making sure that you're the person who does the cooking and the cleaning, and, the man in the relationship does none of that. So restrictive male gender roles, basically, in some relationships. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have a relationship where it is the female in the relationship who is the one using power and control, using threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, and so on, against a male partner or against a female partner. Abusive relationships, they happen in all kinds of relationships. Most of the research, to be transparent, has looked at abusive relationships where the perpetrator is male and the person who is being controlled and abused is female. So most of the research, and this will just become a repetitive statement in this class. Most of the research has been on heterosexual dyads, and a lot of it has focused on male violence against women. Now, I will state, when we look at the data, far more males have been found to engage in this sort of abusive pattern of threat and coercion, intimidation, emotional abuse, and physical abuse than females. That doesn't minimize the fact that there are women who are abusive. It happens. It just isn't to the same degree. And part of why is the fact that we do tend to have in Western culture in particular these strong masculine ideas that make it possible and make it permissible for power and control to be asserted in a way that is abusive of women and also abusive of children as well. So when you hear the phrase toxic masculinity, it's that form of masculinity that encourages and even sort of endorses dominant, threatening, controlling, powerful men. I hesitate to raise the 50 Shades motif, but we have a strong tendency in Western culture and U.S. culture to value domineering, controlling men and to redefine it as romance. And that really is a terrifying idea. There's really no way you can identify Christian Grey as being a nice person. He's not. He's a domineering, controlling, and abusive male. He's kind of like the epitome of toxic masculinity. But, in American culture, the romance narrative tends to make those behaviors things that are both scary but romanticized. And that's a pretty dangerous aspect of American culture. And in fact, Western culture tends to value that in masculinity. Now let's go back to stalking. I wanted to include here some practicalities of thinking about stalking. Because again, the romance narrative, if you have someone who, and it always, I had an argument with my oldest child who, like a lot of 20-something women, really enjoyed the 50 Shades of Grey movies. And I pointed out that, okay, here's a guy who tracks, without her permission, his sexual partner's phone, puts trackers on her car, puts all kinds of restrictions on her movements, really demands access to her all the time. It's very stalky, but it's interpreted as romance. So we need to really talk practically about what is the difference between appropriate attention and stalking. So, as the graphic I've put here, it's not a joke and it's not romantic. It's not okay. There's also a Netflix show called You that some of my students have pointed out as making them really uncomfortable, but kind of sucks them in at the same time with this notion of this guy who stalks and trying to present him in this simultaneously disturbing but also romantic way. So we need to talk about, stalking facts. In some cases, stalking may involve simply watching a victim, but it also may involve damage to your home or your apartment, your vehicle, other elements of your property. It may involve actual invasions of your home and threats of harm. What we know from research on people who have been stalked, that the emotional distress they experience is trauma, up to and including full diagnoses with post-traumatic stress. It tends to greatly restrict what people feel they can and cannot do. on their own. So people report that they increase their security, they limit where they go, they feel like they can't go places alone, that they need to have, need to take extraordinary measures to keep themselves safe. Being on that level of alert all the time is exhausting, and it impairs people's functioning. It drives up their levels of anxiety and increases their vulnerability to depression. Partner violence is often a component of stalking. So you may have a situation where you have an intimate partnership that has been characterized by violence and abuse. When that relationship breaks up, stalking may be a part of what happens in those intervening periods. So the couple where abusive violence has been occurring, they break up, the violent partner is out of, say, the home or the apartment, but they continue to stalk and watch and often invade the space of the partner they've been violent with, often with this sort of waxing and waning where they get back together, the violence comes raging back, they break up, there's more stalking, and so on. Partner stalking is the most common form of stalking. So the stereotype is that stalkers are these strangers with sexual perversions who are lurking in the dark, peeping through windows. That's not typical. What's typical is you have a person who has a romantic interest in another person, and they're very possessive, and they engage in stalking in order to attempt to intimidate and control that other person. This is limited research, but in some of the research that's been done talking to people who have engaged in stalking, they tend to have personalities that lean in the direction of being obsessional. They also tend to tip the scales on, controlling behavior, of wanting to know where people are, what they're doing, who they're talking to, and why they're talking to them. There has been some data to suggest that these are individuals with personality disorders, in particular, borderline personality disorder is a possibility, but more often these are individuals who score higher on scales assessing things like paranoia, antisocial traits, and in some ways obsessive compulsive patterns, but I want you to separate that in your mind from obsessive compulsive disorder. So this is more on the personality side, where you have people who are very perfectionistic, very controlling, and very precise in the way they want their lives to run. And when that falls apart, they can become extra controlling. So when you think about stalking, you can get more information about it at a variety of organizations. One of my favorite is the nomore.org, and that's where I found some useful information to include in this presentation. It's really helpful if you get yourself to wrap your head around what's mythology and what's real. Stalking isn't a myth. It's not something that people bring on themselves. It's not something that they can just wish away. It's often a very dangerous pattern of behavior that can lead to bad outcomes. So if you are concerned about a partner's behavior, that it is becoming obsessive, that it causes you to be afraid, then you can operationalize that in your own head as stalking. There are many of these behaviors that are essentially designed to put you in a fearful state, to keep you dependent, and to keep you under control. They're inherently coercive. One of the problems with our romance narratives in Western culture is that we tend, especially when these behaviors are exhibited by men, to see them as signs of romantic love. The outcome, though, it's not a loving pattern of behavior. It's a coercive and abusive pattern of behavior. So what do we know about the statistics. Millions of people every year report being stalked, and the vast majority report being stalked by someone they actually know. Technology is frequently used as a tool of stalking, and there are lots of ways. You don't have to be a mad hacker to be able to track someone's whereabouts. All you have to do is get them to share their location with you one time, and I have people, I know their location in my phone right now. If I had bad intentions, I could use that against them, but thankfully I don't. Anyway, there are ways that you can be tracked using technology that's fairly simplistic. Stalkers tend to use more than one way of finding out information about you so that they can track your movements and learn ways to control you. The majority of victims are reported to be women, are reported to be female. We do find that when we look at the data, you do see increases in vulnerability when you're looking at diverse populations. 76% of victims of stalking claims are reported by women. Those numbers increase by certain levels depending on which population you're talking about. If you're being stalked, and I hate that we have to have this conversation, but if you're being stalked, if you feel that you're in immediate danger, calling 911 is always an option. If you feel threatened, if you feel like you're being followed, if you feel like you're being put in danger, don't ignore it, because it means you likely are. I had a situation very early in my career where I was teaching this class. I was teaching human sexual behavior, and one of the students in the class came in very distressed one day, right at the beginning of class. She came in, she was white as a sheet, and we were all like, what is happening? What's wrong? And she said, my ex-boyfriend is in the parking lot right now and he won't leave. So that was a situation where, instantly we're all on alert. And I had to call campus security and have the person who was not a student at Mount Union escorted from campus. So that was a situation where, you really have to trust your gut that someone is a threat and that they need to be brought to the attention of authorities. So you do need to take threats seriously. If someone threatens you, take it as a sincere thing. I've known young women who are like, oh, he doesn't mean it. It's just his way of showing me he's absolutely committed to me, and he's just a little jealous, that's all. So if a person threatens to hurt you and talks to you in a coercive manner, it's something that you should take seriously. It's not a sign of romance, it's not a sign of love and commitment when someone threatens to hurt you, or if they threaten to hurt themselves. So sometimes stalkers will talk about killing themselves or murdering people. And again, the romance narratives in our cultural context tend to make those statements sound romantic when they're not. They're incredibly emotionally coercive. There are crisis hotlines through a variety of organizations that you can contact if you feel like you're being stalked, where you can get professional as well as just support, professional advice as well as support for deciding what your options are. For example, the story that I was telling you earlier, the young woman who was in my class, what she was encouraged to do by the police, but also someone from a support organization encouraged her to seek a protection order. The university also sought a protection order to keep this person off campus, but it gave her some legal protections and a sense of security that she could in fact have this person jailed if he broke the rules. And that was very reassuring to her and helpful to her. And in fact, this individual, once the protection order was in place, backed down and took himself out of that environment. So that was a good outcome. These hotlines and other kinds of programs can also give you assistance for more practical issues, social services and so on. If you have a stalker that has shown him or herself to be violent in other contexts, you do need to put a plan in place for how to take care of yourself. Stalking laws vary tremendously from one location to another. In some jurisdictions, stalking laws are very weak and don't do a great deal to protect people from stalking. In some locations, police don't take these claims particularly seriously, or they may seem to not take them seriously, but the real problem is that the law is not written in such a way that people who are engaging in stalking can really be punished. So what that means is that you, as the person who's being stalked, have to create a plan to keep yourself safe until such time as you can get real protections from law enforcement to take care of the problem. So, developing a safety plan, changing routine, having friends go with you places, having a plan in place for what you're going to do if a stalker shows up, and so on, can be helpful. There's also, a tendency for people to want to negotiate with their stalker. Remember, most stalkers are people with whom you've had an intimate relationship in the past. So attempting to engage in some kind of communication to negotiate, to logic your way out of it, or to convince the person to back off, puts you at more risk. It makes you more vulnerable, and it can, in some ways, feed the person's obsessions. If you're being stalked, another set of recommendations, and this is a really long sentence, I should know better with my PowerPoints. I'm breaking all the PowerPoint rules. One thing that you can do if you're being stalked is to document, because that goes a long way, both in the criminal courts and in other kinds of legal venues. If you have some evidence, if you have dates and times, if you have emails and text messages, phone messages, notes, letters, pictures, anything that you can use to document that adds to your credibility. And I included here where it says you click here. If you go to this website, Stalking Prevention Awareness Resource Center, they have, I left this in here to remind myself to mention it. If you go to that website, you can download an incident behavior log if you're being stalked actively, which helps you to organize the kinds of experiences that are going to be, unfortunately we need to do this kind of thing. They're going to be relevant in court, in legal proceedings. They may be usable for justifying a protection order. They may also be usable in proving that a person has engaged in a criminal act. Contacting the police can be tricky because every state has different stalking laws. In some states, these are very strong laws. In other states, they are relatively weaker. So becoming familiar with your state's stalking laws, every state has them, but it's important that you know what they are. Stalkers may have broken other kinds of laws, if they have assaulted you or if they have destroyed your property. Police can, build evidence to that effect, and people can be charged with those offenses as well. If a stalker has used the mail or the phone, there's also the possibility of both state and federal charges. Getting a court order is one way that you can have leverage against a stalker, and can help you to encourage them to stay away from you. Make sure that you're not hiding the fact that you're being stalked. Many people who are being stalked feel guilty, they feel embarrassed and horrified by what's happening. In some ways, they may feel that they're to blame for having started a relationship with someone who turned out to be what they are. So they may not tell anyone. They may keep it a secret, try to manage it on their own. One key way of keeping yourself safe is to increase your circle of people who know that this behavior is happening. It's not necessarily that they form a protective physical wall, but the more people who know, the more likely that the stalker will know that they know, and the more likely that the stalker will back off. At your workplace, at your school, it's important, if you are being actively stalked, to inform those who provide security at those locations. That way, they can provide documentation. They can watch out for the person who is causing problems. For example, at the daycare when my kids were little, there was a situation where an ex-husband was actively stalking not just his ex-wife, but also his children. And there was a notice up on the board in the office that says, if you see this person on the premises, you are to tell the director immediately. If the person appears to be approaching the building, you're to call 911. This was an individual who had been violent with his ex-wife, had been violent with his children, who had threatened them with weapons, and who, while he had served some time in jail, was now out. So that can help if you bring the whole kind of group of people into it to keep a watch. It can be helpful. It's also very validating. You know, when you have all these other people who believe you and they support you, it can be very emotionally helpful as well. And that ends part 2 of chapter 6.